In the dim light of a rainy night in Little Italy, a 6-year-old girl named Gianna did something that would freeze the blood of the city's most dangerous men. She walked up to the untouchable Nichico Valente, pointed at the lion crown tattoo on his arm, and whispered, "My grandma has one just like yours." With those 7 words, 18 years of buried secrets began to unravel. Why did an innocent child hold the key to a mafia boss's past? Tonight, we dive into a story of a debt that time couldn't erase and a sacrifice that returned from the grave to protect a family in their darkest hour.
Imagine a Tuesday night at Rosario's where the air tastes of silence. A 6-year-old angel drifts toward the city's most lethal shadow, her voice a fragile bell. "Excuse me, sir. My Nana has that same mark." Forks drop. Hearts stop. New York's king of ghosts stares at a child. The scent of fresh sourdough dances through the dim light. Steam curls from the machine like ghosts of old conversations. Mr. Constantino, 68 years wise, hums a low melody while scrubbing a counter he's loved for 40 seasons. It's peace, brittle and thin. In the shadows, she waits. Little Gianna, barely 6, with a crown of chaotic curls and eyes that see too much, she gifts smiles to strangers as if the world weren't broken. Her sketchbook is held together by hope and a lost soul's scent. Worn sneakers, a tiny hoodie, and a backpack mended by ghosts. She exists in the quiet ache of waiting. Her mother, Amelia, carries the weight of 3 jobs just to keep the lights on, never earning enough to feed her child from the menu she scrubs pots for. All Gianna has is warm milk, a mercy. If that doesn't break you, outside, an October chill rattles the neon bones of the sign. Inside, 8 souls linger over their meals in a forgettable hum. Then the vibration starts, a low guttural roar of engines that shivers through the floorboards and settles deep in your marrow long before the headlights cut the dark. 3 midnight black SUVs glide to the curb, claiming the asphalt like kings. Mr. Constantino's breath hitches. His color fades to ash. A single name escapes his lips like a curse. Valente. In this neighborhood, that name is a command to keep your head down and finish your plate in silence. You stare at your pasta and pray the Reaper isn't knocking for you. 6 silhouettes emerge. Sharp suits, polished leather, and an aura of absolute stillness. They take their time, letting the cold wind rush in behind them, bringing the scent of expensive cologne, old leather, and the heavy musk of power. A couple by the glass freezes, paralyzed by the sudden winter in the room. The regulars shrink, trying to become invisible. Miss Peggy, 72, white knuckles her handbag. A man drops his paper as if it were made of razor blades. But Gianna doesn't pull back. She doesn't understand the sudden weight. Crayon in hand, she watches the men like a child at a dark carnival. The last one through the door is the storm itself. He moves with a lethal grace, his eyes like frozen steel mapping the room. Nichico Valente, 36, the family's reigning ghost. A man who whispers. He wears a midnight black suit, open at the throat. When he settles, his sleeve retreats, exposing the brand, a crowned lion over crossed blades. To some, it's a shield, to others, a headstone. He raises 2 fingers toward the bar. 6 espressos. That was the only command he gave. The request sends Mr. Constantino into a trembling panic. Gianna feels none of it. Not the tension, not the ice water fear. Her gaze is anchored to that golden lion. She tilts her head, studying the ink with the same pure wonder she saves for the stars. She is not afraid. She recognizes that mark. Faded and small, it lived on the wrist of the woman who tucked her in every night. Now, inches away from the man who owns the city, a little girl in tattered shoes is about to shatter an 18-year-old lie and chill the killer's blood. For those who know that blood and secrets are the same thing, listen closely. We return to the moment Gianna sets her crayon down, climbs off her perch, and walks toward the most dangerous man in the city. Watch what happens when a child touches a monster's soul. Gianna glides off her chair, her scuffed shoes making no sound on the tile. She passes Miss Peggy and a dozen sets of eyes screaming at her to stop. She marches straight toward the table that even the devil would avoid, driven by a memory only she can see. Her tiny footsteps echo in the tomb-like silence of Rosario's. Every beat is a heavy knock on fate's door. Mr. Constantino watches her, his hands wringing a towel until his knuckles turn white. He tries to call her back, but the fear has turned his throat to dry, heavy sand. He gasps a broken, "Gia," but it's too late. She's already standing at Nikiko's elbow. She cranes her neck to meet his gaze. Even sitting, his presence looms like a mountain. Gianna offers him a smile, that fearless, radiant light only a child possesses. Then, she breaks the world's silence. Her voice is a silver bell in a graveyard. "Hello, mister. My grandma has a tattoo just like yours." The words ripple through the restaurant, a soft explosion that changes the air pressure in the room. Every man at that table stops moving, as if time itself had died. Time halts. Across the table, Tommy's hand vanishes beneath the white cloth, his grip tightening on the cold steel at his hip. It's the reflex of a man born in blood. When the unexpected touches the throne, you prepare to end it. His heart beats in his throat. Frankie shifts his weight, turning his massive frame into a wall between the girl and the boss. His eyes hunt for a sniper, a handler, or a reason why a child would speak of the Valenti crest as if it were a simple, colorful daisy in a field. Vinny's silver drops to the plate. Big Sal stops mid-bite. Polly turns to stone. 6 predators, 12 eyes, all locked onto a little girl with messy hair, completely unaware she is standing on the edge of a jagged cliff. They are waiting for the word to strike. Nico is the last to react. He doesn't flinch. He slowly turns his head, the muscles in his jaw shifting like tectonic plates. His gray eyes, cold as a winter morning, settle on her. Not with malice, but with a terrifying razor-sharp focus. The world outside simply stops. He lets the silence weigh on her for 3 agonizing seconds. Then, his voice, a low, gravelly rumble, breaks the spell. "What did you say about your grandmother, little one?" Gianna just blinks, undeterred by the shadow he casts. She is the only one who can still breathe. She wonders why he's so slow to understand. With the patience of a teacher, she lifts her small arm. She points her tiny finger to the soft skin of her wrist, exactly where Grandma Ruthie's ink used to live before the skin grew thin and the memory grew old. My Grandma Ruthie has the same lion here. The crown, the swords, everything. She said it was a gift from a long time ago, a thank you. She beams at him, sharing a forbidden secret. The only sound is the rhythmic, mechanical hum of a ceiling fan overhead. Every heart in the room skips a beat. Nico's eyes search her face for a script, for the tremor of a lie. But there is only the vast, deep brown of innocence. He realizes she isn't a weapon, she's a mirror. Nico exhales a slow, heavy breath that rattles. He drops his voice to a whisper, a tone meant only for his circle, yet it rings through the silence. Her name. Tell me her full name. Gianna doesn't hesitate. "Ruth Ward," she says, her voice clear and bright. The name hangs in the air like a ghost. The name strikes the table like a lightning bolt. Big S, 55 and hardened by a lifetime of sins, freezes. His jaw sets hard. The heavy gold ring on his finger taps once against the wood, a nervous tick from a man who never trembles in the dark. In that quiet, it sounds like a hammer. Ward. Big S murmurs the name like he's tasting old blood. He looks at his boss and delivers the truth that shifts the earth. Ruth Ward, boss, Atlantic City, 1977. The room grows colder with every single word. A heavy shroud of disbelief falls over the men. They are hearing the name of a ghost. Tommy, still ready to draw, looks past the child, searching the street and the shadows for the trap he's sure is coming. He can't believe in miracles, only in betrayals. Boss, Tommy hisses, his voice tight with paranoia. It's a play. They're using the kid to get close. Nico ignores him entirely, his gaze anchored to Gianna. He asks his next question with a softness that is far more terrifying than any loud shout. The mark. Exactly where? Her left wrist, Gianna answers, holding up her own. Right here. Nico gives a single, nearly invisible nod. Then comes the final question that will decide her fate and yours. Tell me exactly what it looks like. Describe every tiny piece. Gianna squints, her brow furrowing as she reaches for the memory. A lion, she whispers, with a golden crown, 2 swords crossed underneath, but her version is much smaller than yours. She pauses, a sudden spark in her eyes as if remembering a long-forgotten story. Oh, and the lion's front leg is messy. Grandma says the man's hand slipped on the boy's tattoo first, so the boy made him put the same mistake on hers. A chair scrapes harshly against the floor, cutting the air like a serrated blade. Tommy stands abruptly, his palm slamming the table. No child could ever know that, he chokes out. Patrons jump. The cook stops. Mr. Constantino hides behind the chrome of the espresso machine, praying for an end to this nightmare. They all know the truth now. Nico merely lifts a finger, and Tommy sinks back into his seat like a puppet with cut strings. Silence returns, heavier than before. Nico looks down at his own arm, at the crowned lion inked by a doctor who has been dead for a decade. That doctor took many secrets to the grave, and the blurred ink was the deepest one, a detail known only to Nico, to the woman he lost, and now, to this child. He feels the ghost of the needle's sting from that long ago night. Then there was the name, Ruth Ward. Nico let his eyes drift shut for a moment. He wasn't in the restaurant anymore. He was 18 again, dying on a freezing floor near the coast, his own blood warm against his skin. He looked up. Gianna sat there, her expression pure and untouched by the memory she had just dragged from the shadows. No more proof was needed. That flawed tattoo on her wrist was a lock only one key could open. He knew with the same certainty he knew his own heartbeat. Big S understood it too. The old soldier sat perfectly still, his eyes measuring the heavy, tragic silence, the thin line between a threat and a miracle. Then he spoke. 1977, Big S began, his voice a low rumble. The boss was only 18. They ambushed him outside Atlantic City. 5 men, blades and broken bones. He was left to bleed out in the dirt. Nico took a slow breath. A nurse found me. She pulled me into a closed clinic with her own hands. No police were called. She locked those doors and stitched my soul back together for 4 days while they hunted me. And that woman was Ruth Ward. The name echoed, heavy with the weight of a debt that never expires. Frankie's hand, which had been ready to draw steel, slowly relaxed and came to rest open on the table, a silent vow of peace. In their world, that open palm meant the bloodlust was over. Tommy, who had been coiled like a spring, exhaled a long, shaky breath and sank into his chair. Vinny followed, placing both hands where everyone could see them. Paulie pulled off his glasses, his eyes cast downward. Nico never looked away from the child as he spoke. Every word was a heavy stone dropped into a deep well. "This girl is one of us," he told his men. She spoke the name of the woman this family owes its very existence to. A profound shift moved through the diner like a turning tide. Every man there realized this wasn't a search for an enemy. This was a reckoning of grace. It wasn't about violence anymore. It was about a sacred debt. Peggy's white-knuckled grip on her bag finally gave way. Her shoulders slumped as the paralyzing terror that had gripped her for an hour finally began to dissolve. The man at the counter let his paper slip, staring at the table in total shock. Near the window, the couple finally forced themselves to swallow, though their silver stayed untouched. The atmosphere had turned from a crime scene to a sanctuary. Mr. Constantino watched from the shadows, his fear replaced by a quiet wonder. At the center of the storm stood Gianna, completely unaware that she had just bridged 18 years of blood and silence for the city's most dangerous men. All she understood was that the wolves in the dark suits didn't seem so hungry anymore. The man with the gray eyes looked at her differently now. The sharpness in his gaze had been replaced by a heavy, aching warmth. Nico leaned back, his eyes searching the distance. He was seeing past the girl, past the diner glass, back to a freezing night 18 years ago that only the men at this table truly understood. Then he looked at Gianna. She stood there with her knuckles white against her sweatshirt, looking like a little girl waiting for a story before bed. Nico took a steady breath. "I will tell you about your grandmother's mark." His voice sounded like an old grave opening. A haunting silence consumed the room. Peggy leaned closer. The man with the news forgot the headlines. Constantino froze with a towel in his hand. Nobody breathed. "I was 18, Nico began, his baritone thick with the past. Nico kept his eyes on the girl, but his words filled every corner of the diner. "My father was dead. I was a boy in an oversized suit, forced to sit on a throne that made grown men scream." Big S watched the table. Frankie's jaw tightened as the story unfolded. "I went to Vegas to meet a partner, someone I trusted." He whispered the word traitor without saying it, the bitterness clear. "The cowards sold my life for a price. 5 shadows trapped me behind a warehouse. No guns, they wanted me to feel every inch of it. They brought steel and wood." Gianna clutched her hoodie. Nico's voice was flat and hollow, like a ghost recounting his own murder. "They carved me open and snapped my ribs. I hit the ground watching my life pour out onto the street. They left me for the crows." He instinctively touched his shoulder, feeling the jagged ghost of the scar beneath his blazer. "I lost the sun. I just remember my knees scraping the pavement, leaving a trail of red behind me. Then I saw a light in the dark. The clinic was shut, but one lamp remained." Gianna's breath hitched. "Grandma," she whispered. "Ruthie, yes," he nodded slowly. "She was the night nurse, staying late. I didn't even knock, I just fell against the glass. The door opened, and there she was." He paused, the cinematic memory playing behind his gray eyes. Imagine the sight, an 18-year-old kid covered in blood and ink, eyes rolling back into his head. Most people would have called the precinct and locked the door. Your grandmother did neither. She chose me. She dragged my broken body inside and bolted the entrance. No questions, no cops. She took what she had on the shelves and stitched my skin back together herself. She fought for me. His voice became a gravelly, low rasp. "The red, boiling water and cheap gin. It worked because Ruthie was a storm in a nurse's uniform. Nico's tone turned cold. The entire room held its breath, lungs burning. On the third day, he murmured, the devils found us. They followed the red trail to her door. They went house to house until they reached her. Gianna's hands trembled. Your grandmother pushed me into a cabinet and locked it. Then she went to face 5 killers alone. The crew came looking for the boy they'd cut down. Nico looked at Gianna, the ice in his heart finally melting into a heavy debt. You want to know her strength? She stood her ground and told them, I am a nurse. I see bleeding men every night. Give me a name or get out. Big S shook his head slowly. Even now, the woman's courage gave him chills. Nico continued, They believed her. She kept me alive for 4 more days. He let the silence settle over them. When I could finally move, I offered her a blank check. Anything in the world. Gianna's voice was a thin, shaking thread. Did she take it? Nico's lips moved into a ghost of a smile. She told me she didn't trade lives for silver, so I had our family crest inked onto her wrist. In my world, that mark is a law. It means she is under my shadow. You don't touch her. You don't even look. Your grandmother is the only person outside this bloodline allowed to carry that shield. Gianna sat in stunned silence, her eyes wet. She tilted her head, a habit Nico recognized. He knew the final chapter would be the hardest to tell. He took a ragged breath, his voice dropping to a whisper that felt like a foundation stone being laid. The morning I walked out of that clinic, the sun hadn't reached the desert yet. My ribs were on fire with every step. He stopped, his gaze darkening, and I saw a little girl. Gianna's eyes flashed. A girl? Yes, maybe 9 years old, standing at the door with a backpack. She just watched me with these brave, quiet eyes. She didn't blink. Ruthie told me it was her girl, off to school. She walked her inside without a single word of fear. Nico's fingers tapped the wood. I looked at that child for 3 seconds and made a vow that would last a lifetime. I swore if Ruth Ward's blood ever needed me, I would be the shield. 10 years or 50, it didn't matter. Gianna's grip on her sweater turned her fingers pale. That little girl, she choked out. Who was she? Nico looked away. His eyes lingered on those swinging kitchen doors. Behind the battered wood, the mundane melody of a shift, water splashing, metal clanking, masked a life about to shatter. The air grew suffocating, thick with a secret decades old. Your mother, he whispered, and the world stopped for Gianna. Her gaze searched his, desperate. My mother? As if fate pulled the strings, the hinges groaned. Amelia Ward emerged, wiping damp hands on her worn trousers, her brown hair spilling from a clip like a woman defeated by a long day's labor. She felt the graveyard silence of the room before she saw them. Then, the nightmare. Her little girl circled by 6 men in razor-sharp suits. Amelia did not think. She threw herself forward, a wall of flesh and bone. Her spine was iron, though her limbs trembled. My daughter is... She is only 6 years old. Her voice cracked, a tiny fracture in her resolve, yet she stood her ground. I apologize if she spoke out of turn, but do not touch her. At 27, Amelia was a specter. Her cheap shirt hung off a frame so fragile it looked brittle. Years of exhaustion haunted her eyes, a silver scar marking her arm. She was the only shield against the city's most dangerous ghosts. Nico stood with the grace of a predator. The chair slid back without a sound. He towered over her, a silent mountain. He did not crowd her, just watched. In his mind, two images collided. The 9-year-old child with her school bag outside that clinic 18 years ago, and the broken woman standing here now, hollowed out, wearing a scar he did not remember. But the eyes were the same. So was the defiance, the way she blocked her child just as Ruth Ward had guarded him 18 years before. "You are the daughter of Ruth Ward," Nico declared. It was not a question. It was an indictment of the past. Amelia went cold. Hearing her mother's name in this place felt like a fever dream. You knew her." The memory hit her like a physical blow. The dim clinic, the blood on the floor her mother had lied about, the muffled groans from the back, the sick man she was not allowed to see. Then the sunrise, and a boy, barely more than a child himself, his shoulder wrapped in white gauze. He had paused at the exit, his eyes burning into hers for 3 long seconds before vanishing into the light. She mapped his face, the steel gray eyes, the heavy jaw, the way he leaned off his left side, the same shoulder that had carried the lead. The jagged puzzle pieces finally clicked. "That boy," she breathed, her voice barely a ghost. "It was you." Nico offered a single heavy nod. Only once. Amelia's legs nearly gave out, undone by the weight of the truth. For the first time in 27 years, the shadows of her mother's past had a human face. She stayed upright only by gripping Gianna's shoulder, her world tilting on its axis. Her lips trembled as nearly 3 decades of fragments began to align. The image sharpened into a painful clarity. Nico read the agony in her face and waited. He pulled out a chair, a silent invitation to collapse. He knew the next truth would require it. Amelia refused to sit. Not yet. Her fingers loosened on Gianna, letting the girl step out from her shadow. After that night, Nico started, his voice low and rhythmic, like a man navigating a minefield of old ghosts. "I spent years hunting for your mother." Amelia's eyes widened. "You looked for her?" "I did," he murmured. "But she was a master at staying hidden." His gray gaze held hers, calculating the weight of his words. "Ruth vanished from Vegas the day I did. New identity, New York City. No digital footprint, no paper trail. She erased herself." Amelia started to ask why, but he saw the question coming. "She wanted you 1,000 miles away from men like me." He spoke without bitterness, stating a cold fact, just as Ruth Ward used to do. A tightness coiled in her chest. All these years, the mystery of their flight from Vegas when she was 9 haunted her. The new name, the quiet life. She'd always blamed her father, the man who walked out when she was 4. Her mother wasn't fleeing a husband, but a fate. She was guarding her from a darkness she'd touched only once. "I eventually found her," Nico said. A new gravity pulled at his voice, the heavy ache of a promise kept too long. 2 years ago, my scouts found a door in the Bronx." He paused, his jaw tightening into a hard line. "By the time I stood on that porch, Ruth was already gone. Cancer took her a few months before I arrived." Amelia did not scream. She just turned to stone. Then the dam broke. Quiet, steady tears. A 2-year-old mourning finally finding its way out. This was not the dull ache she lived with every day. This was the sharp, jagged agony of a truth that arrived far too late. Her mother was not just a tired nurse bringing home soup at 2 a.m. She was the woman who dragged a bleeding 18-year-old boy into the light, stitched his skin with her own hands, and stood down 5 gunmen at the door, claiming, "I saw no one." She'd said it with a coldness that made monsters blink. Her mother had been a titan, and she'd never known. "I went to her grave," Nico added, his voice a ghost of a sound. "I left flowers, I made a vow there, the same one I made 18 years ago. If her blood ever needed me, I would be there. He locked eyes with her. But you were a ghost, moving constantly, jumping from job to job. No phone, no trace, I lost the trail. Amelia closed her eyes. She knew the reason. It was not a choice to hide. It was the cruelty of poverty. Never having enough to stay in one place for more than 2 years. A spiked rent, a lost shift. Each was a reason to run. She had not been hiding from him. She was just being swept away by a life too weak to take root. At her side, Gianna looked up, seeing the salt trails on her mother's cheeks. Without a word, the child did the only thing she understood. She wrapped her arms around Amelia's waist, burying her face in her mother's apron. She held on with everything she had, terrified that her mother might simply dissolve into the air. Then the girl's own sobs began. For her mother, for Grandma Ruthie, and for the suffocating silence of the room. Big Saw watched the pair, then spoke in a rumble meant only for those at the table. Ruth Ward was one of a kind. Frankie gave a slow, somber nod. Tommy stared at the hand that, 30 minutes ago, had reached for his piece, thinking the kid was a plant. Vinny looked away, jaw set. Polly took off his glasses, rubbing the bridge of his nose. 6 men. 6 men who lived in blood and noise, sat frozen in the tiny diner. They watched a broken woman and her child weep. Nobody moved. It was a silence that did not belong in their world. The weight of an unpaid debt stood before them in a damp shirt and a stained apron. How do you pay back a life? As Amelia clung to Gianna, the wetness still on her skin, her phone began to vibrate in her pocket. She tried to drown it out, but the buzzing was relentless, a frantic pulse against her hip. The caller was not letting go. Wiping her eyes, she pulled it out. Her landlady, the woman who only called when the rent was late. Amelia answered. The woman's voice was a jagged edge, sharp with a fear Amelia had never heard. Ward, 2 men were here. They kicked in your door, trashed the place, told me to keep my mouth shut. You owe me 2 months and I won't have my building burned down. Amelia gripped the plastic until her knuckles turned white. Before she could hang up, a second call buzzed through. Angie from the 3rd Street Market. Her voice felt like ice water down Amelia's spine. Amelia, listen to me. 2 guys were here asking for your shift. I told them nothing, but they know about Gianna. One of them said, Gianna, 6 years old, loves that place on Mulberry. Then he just laughed. Get out of there. Amelia let the phone drop. The color fled her face, leaving her paler than when she first saw the men in suits. Before, the threat had a face, now it was a shadow. An invisible monster knew Gianna's name, her routine, and had just gutted their only sanctuary. Gianna looked at her mother and saw a mask of terror that required no translation. Mommy, what happened? Her voice was a tiny tremor as she twisted the fabric of Amelia's sleeve. Amelia could not find a single word to save her. She had no comfort to give. But Nico had caught every word. He did not have to try. In the hollow quiet of Rosario's, the landlord's screams and Angie's desperate warnings were impossible to ignore. Nico stood up, his movements heavy and precise, the calculated calm of a storm. His shadow stretched across the floor as he reached his full height. His gray eyes locked onto Amelia, his focus cutting through her to the enemy beyond. Someone has marked you. It was not a question. His voice was a flat line, the terrifying stillness before the lightning strikes. Amelia pulled Gianna closer, chin trembling but high. She had always fought alone. This is not your problem. I will deal with it myself. Nico looked at her shaking hand, still white-knuckling the phone. and Gianna weeping against her side. His voice was a low hum, barely audible over the fan, yet it carried the weight of a mountain. You are trembling. Your child is broken, and you claim you have this. A heavy silence followed. 18 years ago, your mother saved me without a second thought. Tonight, I am not asking for your permission to save you. The protest died in Amelia's throat. She locked eyes with Gianna, a fragile blend of terror and absolute faith, and her choice was made. Amelia would walk into the fire for herself, but never for her girl. Her silence became her surrender, a wordless vow that Nico read with a single nod. The air in the room shifted, turning heavy and electric. Frankie huddled in the corner, his voice a low, gravelly rasp into the phone as he made 2 urgent calls. Tommy didn't waste a second. His hand blurred as he checked his sidearm before sliding toward the entrance, his eyes hunting for shadows across the pavement. Big S took the side door, his weathered frame a wall of meat and bone, his instincts sharpened by 55 years of surviving the concrete jungle. Near the counter, Vinny and Polly traded a few hushed words before moving like ghosts to seal the kitchen exit. Constantino stood paralyzed, watching his humble dining room transform into a steel-clad bunker in less than 30 seconds. From the moment Nico spoke, it took only half a minute for those 6 men to turn every window and door into a fortress. Not a single soul raised their voice. It was just 6 suits moving with the cold, mechanical grace of a clockwork trap. In the heart of the storm, Amelia pulled Gianna tight, feeling the sudden, heavy realization that she was no longer fighting the world alone. Outside, 3 black SUVs roared into life. Their engines vibrated through the glass, a synchronized snarl like a pack of wolves waking for the hunt. Nico guided them toward the exit, his hand hovering just inches from her shoulder, a silent, invisible shield protecting her from the night. Gianna's tiny fingers gripped her mother's hand as she stared at the 3 obsidian vehicles gleaming under the orange streetlights. Constantino watched from the shadows of his doorway until the final door clicked shut. The convoy surged forward instantly, with Polly leading the way, his eyes scanning the horizon like a predator on the prowl. Nico sat with the mother and child in the central car, while Frankie kept watch from the front. Tommy and Vinny held the rear, forming a wall of iron that ensured no one could touch their 6. The 3 machines glided through the heart of Manhattan, their dark glass reflecting the neon veins of the city. Tucked against the door, Gianna felt her terror melt into a child's quiet wonder as the world sped by in a blur of color. She pressed her small face to the window, leaving a foggy breath mark on the glass. Mommy, it's like we're in a movie. Like we're the most important people in the world. Amelia pulled her closer, her chin resting on the girl's soft curls, unable to find the words to answer. Her throat felt like it was filled with glass, her mind stuck on the image of their ruined home. Across the seat, Nico remained a statue of silence, his face illuminated by the cold blue flicker of his phone. He read every update with gray eyes that held no warmth and offered no comfort. The time for talk had passed. As the tires hummed over the Brooklyn Bridge, the radio hissed to life. Polly's voice came through, cold and clinical. Boss, we've got a tail, black van, no plates, staying 3 car lengths back. They're steady on us. Frankie looked back at Nico. The man didn't move, though his thumb froze over the screen. Then Tommy's voice crackled through the speakers, tight with the itch for violence. Do we lose them, or do we end them? Nico's reflection met Frankie's in the rearview mirror. After a heavy, suffocating heartbeat, he spoke, his voice a low, terrifying calm that dictated the coming minutes. Lead them into the dead end at Pier 46. Tommy, you seal the back. Polly, block the front. Make it clean, no gunfire. Frankie signaled the team. The formation shifted instantly. The lead car accelerated, looping back around while the middle vehicle veered toward the water. The rear car slowed down, gently herding the black van into the mouth of the trap. Gianna felt the sharp tilt of the turn. "Mommy, where are we?" Amelia held her tight, whispering that everything would be okay. Less than 3 minutes later, the van rolled into the shadows of Pier 46. Polly slammed the front gate shut while Tommy's car cut off the only exit. The warehouse walls rose up like tombstones on both sides. Vinny and Tommy were out of their seats before the wheels stopped spinning. They ripped the van doors open and dragged the two men into the dirt, slamming them onto the concrete before they could even draw breath. Frankie stripped them of their gear, cracking open a phone and pulling an envelope from a jacket pocket. Inside were the ghosts of Amelia's life, photos of her at the market, looking exhausted, her hair messy and tired. Then came the shots of Gianna playing outside the restaurant with her little cat backpack. Frankie handed the evidence through the window. Nico looked at the child first, then the mother. For 5 agonizing seconds, the only sound in the car was the hum of the air conditioning. When Amelia saw those pictures, the blood in her veins turned to ice. Her baby, herself. They had been hunted like prey, and she had never even felt the eyes on her. Nico folded the photos and slipped them into his breast pocket, close to his heart. He stared out into the gloom of the pier, his voice dropping to a temperature that made even Frankie shiver. Maddox put his hands on the Ward family. That was his suicide note. A moment later, the private elevator hissed open at the penthouse, and Gianna stepped out first. The little girl stopped dead, her mouth hanging open. Her eyes jumped from the polished oak floors to the massive wall of glass where Manhattan lay at her feet. A sprawling carpet of diamonds tossed onto black velvet. The air inside smelled of cedar and warmth, a world away from the cold streets. There was a marble kitchen and a soft gray leather sofa bathed in amber light. It was a sanctuary behind bulletproof glass and silent cameras. Gianna didn't wait. She ran. She flew through the rooms, her voice echoing with a frantic, beautiful joy. "Mommy, the bathtub is a swimming pool. There are 2 fridges." Amelia stood still, a sharp, aching pain blooming in her chest as she watched her daughter discover a life they had never even dreamed of. The sorrow didn't come from the luxury, but from the realization of how little they'd had. A 6-year-old girl shouldn't think a full refrigerator is a miracle. Nico walked in last, exchanging a few final, quiet words with his men. As the steel doors closed, Nico shed his heavy jacket. He rolled up his sleeves, revealing the dark ink of the Valente crest on his arm. He looked around his empty palace, then finally at Amelia. "You're safe here tonight. There's food in the kitchen. Take the room at the end. Frankie will get you whatever else you need." Amelia couldn't find her voice, only nodding as she led Gianna away to wash her face. She found a new t-shirt waiting on the bed, still crisp with the tags on. She tucked her daughter in and kissed her, but Gianna's eyes were wide with wonder. 20 minutes passed before Amelia walked back into the main room. Gianna was already there, curled on the floor by the glass wall with her old sketchbook and a single crayon. A few feet away, Nico stood by the window, his voice a low, rhythmic murmur into his phone. He ended the call when he saw the little girl behind him. "Still awake?" She shook her head and held up her book. "I'm drawing you." Nico watched her in silence as she finished her work. She held up the yellowed paper showing a man in a black suit with a bright, crooked halo over his head. "Is it you?" Nico stared at the drawing for what felt like an eternity. Why the halo? Because, she whispered, you look like an angel in a black suit. He turned back to the window, his face hidden in the shadows. If she had looked up, she would have seen his jaw turn to stone. She would have seen the city lights catch the glint of a single tear before he forced it away. Amelia saw it all from the hallway, leaning against the wall, watching the most dangerous man in the city crumble before a child's sketch. A strange, heavy ache settled in Amelia's soul. When Gianna finally fell asleep on the sofa, Nico laid a blanket over her with the stiff, uncertain movements of a man who had never known the softness of a family. Then he stepped out onto the balcony, and Amelia followed. They stood in the midnight chill for a long time before she spoke. Why? Is this for my mother? Nico didn't look at her. He watched the mist crawl over the river, his voice sounding like it was coming from a long way off, as if the truth was too heavy to carry. When I was 18, the world saw me as a monster or a target. Your mother was the only soul who saw a bleeding kid instead of a thug. He stopped, his voice catching. No one has looked at me with that much mercy since the day she died. He finally turned to face her, his eyes raw and stripped of all his cold armor. Until your daughter looked at me tonight. Amelia's breath hitched, and the tears finally broke through. She turned her head, wiping them away with her sleeve, hating the way her heart was breaking. Nico gave her the mercy of his silence, looking back at the skyline so she could cry in peace. I'll deal with Maddox, he said, his voice returning to a flat, lethal tone. When I'm done, you won't ever have to look over your shoulder again. I don't want your money, she whispered. This isn't about money, Nico replied, his eyes fixed on the horizon. This is a blood debt. It's different. He started to walk away, but as he passed the glass door, he whispered, Your mother deserved a better life, and so do you. Sunlight bled through the glass in long, golden stripes, painting the floorboards. On the couch, little Gianna lay huddled under her blanket, her tiny fist clutching a silver lion, a token of a world she didn't yet understand. Amelia stood in the kitchen, nursing a cold brew and watching her daughter's chest rise and fall. She clung to the silence, knowing it was fragile. Sure enough, at 7:15, the elevator chimed. Frankie stepped out, followed by Tommy, Vinny, Big S, and Polly. They'd changed their clothes, but their eyes were heavy with the night's toll. Nico sat at the head of the table, sleeves pushed back, staring at a cup of espresso that had long since gone cold. Frankie placed a phone on the wood and gave a silent nod. Nico pressed play. A voice, thin, young, and vibrating with a lie, cut through the room. Brooklyn Heights penthouse, top floor. The woman and the kid are there. Valente's staying the night. A gruff reply followed. Understood. Stay ready. We strike tomorrow. The recording went dead. The silence that followed was suffocating. Then Tommy's eyes drifted toward a young driver at the edge of the group. A kid hired 3 months ago, now trying to vanish into the walls. Hearing his own betrayal played back turned his hope to ash. He went pale as a ghost, his eyes darting frantically toward the ceiling like a rat in a corner. But the truly chilling part? Nico wouldn't even grant him a glance. In another life, there would have been yelling or a weapon drawn. Instead, Nico just stared into the black dregs of his coffee. He gave Frankie one microscopic nod. Frankie stood up, walked around the table, and rested a heavy hand on the boy's shoulder. Let's go. His tone was almost friendly, like inviting a pal for coffee. The kid's legs were like jelly as he was led to the elevator. The door slid shut, and then nothing. Nico took a sip of that bitter espresso and started talking, as if he'd just crossed a chore off his list. Maddox was coming. Nico was counting on it. The strategy was simple: turn the penthouse into a spider's web. We'd leave the lights on and the curtains slightly parted to make it look cozy, while my boys hid in every dark corner. Once Maddox stepped inside, the trap would snap shut. But first, Gianna needed to be safe. Nico told Polly to take her to the Staten Island hideout and wait for his word. Just the two of them knew the location. 10 minutes later, the little girl woke up, her curls messy. When Amelia told her she was going with Uncle Polly, Gianna's eyes searched for only one person. She saw Nico by the elevator and sprinted across the polished floor, almost slipping before she reached him. "Mr. Nico," she whispered. He looked down. "I have to leave," she said. "You're going to stop the bad man, right?" Nico froze, struck by the absolute trust in those brown eyes. It wasn't the loyalty of a soldier, it was the pure faith of a child. "Catch the monster. Then come back so we can color," she added, her tone so sincere it hurt. She wrapped her tiny arms around his waist, burying her face in his shirt. Nico went rigid. His hands hovered at his sides, useless, like a man who hadn't been held by a child in 36 years. With a strange, clumsy tenderness, he patted her back as if she were made of porcelain. "I promise." Polly led her away, and as the elevator doors closed on her waving hand, the apartment felt suddenly, hollowly quiet. Amelia didn't move. She just stared at the elevator before turning her gaze to Nico. "I'm staying." He wasn't surprised. He'd seen that steel in her eyes when they discussed the plan. She wasn't a woman who ran. He told her she belonged with her daughter, but she stood her ground. "My mother didn't run that night in Vegas, and neither will I." Looking at her, Nico didn't see a liability. He saw the ghost of Ruth Ward staring back at him. It made his chest ache. "You're her double," he muttered. She didn't blink. By 11 o'clock, the penthouse was swallowed by darkness. Only thin ribbons of city light cut through the curtains, giving the illusion of a sleeping home. A faint glow lingered under the stove hood. A half-finished glass of milk sat on the counter near Gianna's tiny shoes. It was a perfectly crafted stage, built for an audience of one, but this set was designed to bite. Tommy lay flat behind the sofa, his breath steady. Vinny was a shadow in the bedroom closet, watching through the crack. Big S sat in the kitchen's gloom, calm as a fisherman waiting for a nibble. 4 more guys guarded the stairs and lobby. Nico sat in his dark office, the only light being the pulse of his phone. In the next room, Amelia sat on the floor, hugging her knees in the dark. The tremors had passed. Now there was only the cold weight. At 11:23, the message arrived. "They're here." It was Ray Maddox, a man Nico had discarded 2 years ago for being a rat. He'd scraped together his own crew and thought he knew Nico's playbook. He brought 15 men, thinking a 3-pronged assault would do the trick. He was wrong. The elevator chimed at the penthouse level. 5 guys stepped out with their guns raised, creeping across the oak floors. They saw the little shoes and the milk glass, thinking they were closing in on a family. They took 4 more steps into the trap. Then, the darkness fought back. Tommy rolled out from behind the couch like a blur, taking out the lead man's legs before he could even blink. Suddenly, the kitchen lights exploded into life. Big S hit the switch, blinding them. Vinny burst from the closet like a ghost, dropping the nearest man before the sound of the door hitting the wall even registered. Glass sprayed across the fire escape as Maddox's second crew met Frankie's guys. It was a brutal symphony of bone hitting bone. A body tumbled down the concrete stairs with a series of dull, heavy thuds. No gunfire was heard. Nico had outlawed it. Downstairs, Maddox's third team found themselves trapped. Power was cut, doors were sealed, and Frankie's men closed in from the shadows. They surrendered without a word. Upstairs, the lights were bright as noon. 7 of Maddox's men were face down on the wood. They were alive, but their night was over. Tommy kicked their guns aside like they were discarded toys. Vinny moved through them with cold precision. Big S just stood there, looking at the wreckage of Maddox's ego with a pitying stare. Frankie walked in, his knuckles split and bloody. "It's done," he signaled. But Nico was elsewhere, his mind running the numbers. 15 men were promised, 15 were caught. But the leader was missing. The math added up, but the man didn't. Maddox was gone. Nico's head snapped toward Amelia's room, and he sprinted down the hall, his heart hammering against his ribs. He burst into her room. It was empty. Amelia was gone. It hit him then, the old maintenance exit, a route he'd ignored because it was supposed to be locked from the inside. But Maddox had been his partner. He knew the blueprints. For the first time in his life, Nico Valente didn't walk. He ran. He sprinted toward that service corridor, desperation clawing at his throat. He found the door ajar, a sliver of red light bleeding out. Then he heard it, Amelia's choked, terrified cry and a man's voice, rough and jagged as broken glass. That gravelly tone belonged to one man, Ray Maddox. 2 winters had not dulled its edge. Nico kicked the door wide to find Maddox backed against the wall, Amelia trapped against his chest. A rough arm crushed her throat while a pistol pressed hard against her temple. Her fingers tore at the limbs, suffocating her, her complexion turning a bruised violet as she fought for oxygen. Yet she did not panic. She had sprinted back to warn them of the vulnerability, arriving 60 seconds too late. Maddox met Nico's eyes and bared his teeth in a sickening smirk. It was the expression of a cornered beast playing its final card. "Valente!" Maddox dragged her toward the center of the penthouse, the barrel digging into her skin, his focus fixed entirely on Nico. He craved a witness. Nico trailed them, his stride slow and deliberate, palms open and empty at his sides. He shoved Amelia into the center of the ruined parlor. Tommy, Frankie, and Vinny whirled around, then turned to stone. Tommy's hand twitched toward his holster by sheer habit. Frankie caught his arm. "Hold!" The steel was already at her skull. "Stay back!" Maddox shrieked, his voice cracking with a volatile blend of rage and sheer terror. He was a man falling off a cliff, desperate to drag everyone down with him. "One move and she is gone." Frankie retreated. Tommy stood his ground, jaw locked tight. Vinny hung back at the shadows. Then Nico stepped fully into the light. His posture was fluid, his expression an unreadable mask of ice. He stared straight through Maddox. "Maddox." Nico's tone was chillingly hollow. "Your 15 soldiers are cold. You are hiding behind a woman. How exactly do you think this ends for you?" Maddox's grip tightened, bruising Amelia's neck. "It ends with my exit, or her funeral." Nico offered no reply. Instead, his eyes drifted to Amelia. She met his gaze. Despite the weapon and the lack of air, her eyes remained remarkably focused. It was not the stillness of someone giving up. It was the absolute serenity of faith. It was the same look Ruth Ward gave 5 assassins outside a clinic 18 years ago when she lied to keep him alive. Amelia's lips barely twitched, her voice a ghost of a sound, traveling across the 2 meters of electrified air. "I am okay. Take the shot." Nico understood perfectly. His eyes flickered toward the corner behind Maddox, where Vinny had dissolved into the shadows, inching closer while the hostage-taker was distracted. One noiseless footstep at a time, Vinny drifted into the dead zone along the plaster. Maddox was blind to him, his tunnel vision locked on Nico. The signal was nothing more than Nico's eyelids heavying for a heartbeat too long. Vinny struck, a lightning-fast blow where the neck meets the spine. Maddox's body buckled, his pupils blown wide with disbelief. His grip failed, the handgun clattering loudly against the timber. He slumped to the ground, his strength evaporating, and Tommy was on him in a heartbeat, pinning him like lead. Frankie kicked the weapon across the room. Amelia faltered, her equilibrium vanishing as she reached out for anything solid. Nico reached her before the others, his palms firm on her shoulders, anchoring her. He did not let go. She stayed upright in his arms, her face tilted toward his. Close enough to catch the silver shards in his gray irises, she glimpsed a phantom she never expected. Terror. Not of the man broken on the floor, not of the Reaper. He had walked with ghosts since he was 18. This was a new haunting. This was the agonizing fear of failing her, of being 3 seconds too slow, of watching another woman named Ward bleed out under his protection. She witnessed the depth of his soul and realized this transcended any debt. Tommy and Vinny dragged Maddox out through the service door. Frankie followed, whispering 3 sentences into a burner phone. No questions were asked. No words were wasted. The Valente Code was simple. The boss's word was law. Information was a luxury no one possessed. Just like that, Maddox was deleted. Scrubbed from the suite, the city, and the very memory of the night. Nico took in the wreckage, shattered glass, a splintered table, scuffs on the expensive oak and holes in the plaster. Trivial things, quiet scars from a confrontation that could have left the world in ruins. He looked at Amelia. She was perched on the couch, motionless as a statue, staring at nothing, like someone who had just survived a hurricane, waiting for the ringing in her ears to stop. "Bring Gianna," Nico ordered Frankie, who immediately dialed Polly. Half an hour passed before the black vehicle returned. Gianna leaped out before it even stopped, sprinting into the foyer just as her mother emerged from the lift. "Mommy!" The cry rang through the lobby, so thick with relief the security guard had to look away. Amelia collapsed to her knees, pulling the girl into a crushing embrace, burying her face in the child's hair. Then came the tears, not from trauma, but from sheer grace. Gianna was there, warm, smelling of clean linen, her tiny heart thumping against her own. Darkness had not claimed her world tonight. Nico watched the reunion from the car, silent as the grave. Frankie stood nearby, equally still. Some moments are sacred, even for men with blood on their hands. Nico pulled open the back door. "Get inside. I am moving you to the new residence." Amelia looked up, her vision blurred. He rattled off the features: high security, a bedroom for Gianna, Eastern Light, as if checking off a list. But she felt the underlying truth. He had arranged this months ago. This was not a reaction to Maddox. It was destiny, perhaps since he first discovered her identity. Perhaps since the day he knelt at her mother's headstone. Amelia did not argue. Tonight she was too exhausted to fight a gesture of mercy. A trio of dark vehicles formed a final procession. Polly led the way with Nico, Amelia, and Gianna in the middle car. Tommy and Vinny trailed behind. Big S sat in the front seat, his eyes scanning the pavement by instinct, even though the storm had passed. They glided across the Manhattan Bridge, city lights streaking the glass like falling stars. Curled up against the door, Gianna pressed her nose to the window, her breath fogging the pane as the street lamps blurred into long lines of gold. "Look, Mommy, we have superheroes protecting us," she whispered. "Like we are famous." Amelia managed a fragile, weary smile. It was a heartbreaking mix of relief and the realization that, to a 6-year-old, this nightmare felt like a fairy tale. And something more for the man sitting opposite her, who looked at the street but saw only the past. The convoy turned onto a quiet, leafy Brooklyn block, bathed in the amber glow of the lamps, the air silent save for the rhythmic chirping of crickets. 3 dark cars came to a rest before a 4-story brick house, their engines humming with a vibration that shook the nearby windows. Lights flickered on the 2nd floor, then the 3rd. Shadows began to dance behind the curtains. Neighbors peered through the high beams. 6 doors clicked open simultaneously. 6 men in tailored suits stepped out, their shoes rapping against the pavement. They formed a silent semicircle around the center car, and the door swung open. Amelia stepped out, Gianna, a warm, sleeping weight on her shoulder. The girl's chestnut ringlets fell over her mother's arm, her tiny sneakers hanging limp. From the 2nd story, a woman in a robe and curlers pushed her window open. She looked down at the 3 polished cars, the 6-armed men, and the tired woman holding her daughter. Her jaw dropped as she clung to the windowsill. Her whisper drifted down the quiet street. What on earth? The engines stayed on. The cars sat in a perfect row, aligned with surgical precision against the curb. Suddenly, the high beams flared to life. A blinding white light washed over the brickwork, reflecting off the glass of the entryway. It turned the street into a brightly lit stage. The woman upstairs remained frozen, joined now by her husband, his glasses sliding down his nose. More lights appeared on the 3rd floor. A door on the ground level opened a crack. A young man peeked out, then vanished, seeing the 6 figures. The entire neighborhood was an audience for a drama they could not fathom. Nico cut the engine and stepped out. He performed an act that his crew had never seen in all their years of service. He slid off his jacket, folded it neatly, and set it on the hood. Then he went down on one knee. He lowered himself slowly until he was eye to eye with Gianna. She stood beside her mother, blinking against the light, her hair a mess. But when Nico knelt, her sleepiness vanished. It was not fear. A 6-year-old understands that when a giant of a man lowers himself to her world, the words he speaks carry weight. Nico placed a hand on the girl's shoulder. A massive hand, scarred and built for violence, yet it landed with the weight of a feather. Gianna, he murmured, his voice velvety and kind, a total departure from his usual stone. Look at me. Gianna obeyed, her focus absolute. From this day on, if anyone ever troubles you, he paused, letting the weight of his promise hang in the air. Anyone at all? A ghost of a smile touched his eyes. You just tell them, my grandmother saved Valente, he whispered. That will be enough. Gianna beamed, a radiant, innocent smile. She lunged forward, her tiny arms wrapping around his neck, burying her face in his shoulder. She held him with all her might, a burden that felt like nothing at all. Nico froze, his arms hanging uselessly. It was like the penthouse all over again, but now the whole world was watching. Hesitantly, he raised a hand and gave her 2 stiff, awkward pats on the back. The motion was so alien that Tommy had to look away to keep from laughing. When Gianna let go, her face was glowing. Nico stood up, brushing the dust from his knee with habitual care. He turned to Amelia. From his inner pocket, he pulled something small and delicate, a relic whose color had faded long ago. It was a silk cloth, turned amber with age, its fibers worn thin. He pressed it into Amelia's palm. 18 years ago in Vegas, Ruth used this to stop my bleeding. I took it when I fled. She never realized. He looked down at the scrap of silk. For nearly 2 decades, I have kept it close. A reminder that someone saved me and expected nothing in return. He looked back at her. Now it finally goes home. Amelia clutched it, her fingers trembling against the fragile history. The ghost of sterile spirits lingered, a scent of her mother's clinic clinging to the fabric of Ruth's memory. Nico reached into his coat, producing a delicate silver lion, etched with the precision of a craftsman's soul. It was a flawless miniature of the ink on his skin. With heavy, scarred fingers, he secured the clasp around her throat. Frankie shifted, as if to assist, then froze. Nico whispered, "This is so you never forget. A guardian will always walk beside you." Gianna gripped the metal, headlights reflecting in her wide eyes. Amelia watched the exchange, feeling the final heavy droplets of the evening finally escape her lashes and fall away. These tears were born of recognition, the relief of a daughter realizing her mother's legacy survived. "I thought she was lost to time," Amelia whispered. Nico met her gaze. "Her memory is eternal here." Behind him, Frankie bowed. One by one, the men, Tommy, Vinny, the whole crew, gave their silent respect. No words stained the air. The heavy beams illuminated 6 silhouettes offering a wordless vow at 2 a.m. on that quiet, forgotten street. It was more than enough. Inside, the click of a switch flooded the room with a steady, amber glow. It washed over fresh timber floors and a plush sofa. For once, the light did not tremble or fade. The walls were dry, the air free of metallic tang of rusted pipes. It was a modest sanctuary, 2 bedrooms and a kitchen where the water actually ran hot, a luxury they had only ever dreamt of possessing. Cleanliness and warmth were their new riches. Gianna didn't wait for permission. She broke free from her mother's grip, her little footsteps echoing as she explored every corner, from the tiled bath to her own small room. "Look, Mommy, a closet of my own." A ghost of a smile touched Amelia's lips, a movement her tired face had almost forgotten. She settled onto the cushions, tracing fabric that 18 years ago had been stained by blood. Breathless, Gianna collapsed beside her, her eyes drifting to the silver band on Amelia's arm. It was Ruth's inheritance, the lion and the crossed blades that had always been just a pretty trinket from a grandmother she barely knew. The child's fingers gently turned the metal, looking up with sudden clarity. "Mommy," she murmured, "the symbol doesn't make me shiver anymore." Amelia stroked her hair. "Is that so, darling?" Gianna's tiny chin set with absolute resolve. It was the unwavering certainty only a child possesses. "A kind man gave this to Grandma Ruthie because she mended him," Gianna explained. Amelia pulled her close, her heart swelling with a tightness that was finally something other than sorrow. It was the simplicity of it. 18 years of tragedy reduced to a debt of gratitude. She saved him. He remembered. Gianna hopped down, retrieving a pink diary, a final memento from the woman who started this ripple through time. Lying on the floorboards, she scribbled in messy, bold letters, "Grandma rescued Mr. Valente." Then, with the focus of an artist, she reached for her old crayons to color in the rest of the story. Amelia observed the quiet scene from the sofa. Minutes later, the notebook was held high. It depicted a man in a dark suit, his shoulders broad and eyes grave, yet his mouth carried a kindness only innocence could detect. Glowing yellow wings hovered over his head. "That is Mr. Nico," Gianna declared. "He is a hero who wears a suit instead of a cape." Amelia's vision blurred. "Yes, honey, I believe he truly is a hero." Clutching the silver lion, Gianna crawled under fresh blankets, new sheets and soft pillows, luxuries that seemed like a fever dream only a few hours ago. Amelia tucked the edges in, sealing her daughter's peace for the night. The pendant shimmered in the girl's palm. "Mama," she whispered into the quiet air. "I'm right here, sweetie." I think the shadows aren't scary anymore. Amelia sat on the edge, smoothing the hair back from her daughter's brow. How come? Because I know someone is out there, keeping us safe. Amelia pressed a kiss to her forehead, trying to freeze this moment before it dissolved into just another yesterday in their long, hard journey. The light vanished, replaced by a silver sliver of moon cutting through the drapes. The beam danced across the floorboards, coming to rest on the tiny silver lion clutched in a small, sleeping hand in the dark. Dreams finally took her. Outside, the Jersey wind sighed against the window panes in a slow, hypnotic pulse. The apartment grew still, wrapped in the pale glow of the midnight sky and the safety of the shadows. The muffled city hummed in the distance, a ferry's groan, a distant door. Then came the rhythmic purr of a powerful engine. It didn't stop, just cruised past, a silent sentinel patrolling the borders of their new world. As the engine faded, Gianna's lips moved in a sleepy secret meant only for her pillow. "Sleep well, Mr. Valente." Amelia stood in the shadow of the doorway, watching her child find a rest she'd never known. She lingered until the girl's grip on the necklace loosened and her breath turned shallow. The moonlight exposed the hollows of exhaustion on Amelia's face and the faint kitchen grease still clinging to her skin from Rosario's. She looked at the silver crest on her own wrist, the heavy legacy her mother carried every day. The mystery of Ruth's life finally unraveled in the dark. For the first time, Amelia truly understood her mother's heart. A smile bloomed on her lips, one that didn't taste of unpaid rent or the crushing weight of 3 dead-end jobs. It was a lightness she hadn't felt since she was a little girl playing in the clinic, pure and untethered, just like her mother's laughter. She returned to the living room, folding the old silk handkerchief with reverent care beside the pink diary. Suddenly, the screen of her phone ignited in the quiet. An unknown contact flashed 5 simple words. "Bolt the door, rest easy." Signed only with a single initial, N. Amelia's thumb trembled over the glass, typing and erasing as she sat alone in the silent room. She finally sent back a simple blessing. "Good night, Nico." After double-checking the locks out of a lifetime of habit, she let the darkness take the room, listening only to the steady, safe rhythm of Gianna's breathing. A cycle spanning 18 years finally closed its loop. In Jersey, a child slept with a silver lion. Across the Hudson, a man in a black sedan watched his screen, the city lights reflecting off the dark glass. The coldness in his expression flickered and died. A ghost of a smile appeared for a heartbeat, then vanished into the shadows. It was the night a little girl realized that wolves can sometimes be guardians. Amelia saw her mother not just as a nurse, but as a savior a kingpin could never forget. And in the dark, a man remembered that some debts are paid in blood and others in silent protection. Obligations can sleep for 18 years, buried under a life of sin, but they always wake. Ruth Ward mended a broken boy, and nearly 2 decades later, that mercy became a fortress for her own blood. You never truly realize how a single, forgotten act of humanity can become the armor that protects your family when the world turns cold many years down the line. In the shadows, a debt of honor never rots. A simple kindness can rewrite an entire legacy and change a life forever. Every lineage holds a moment of grace that echoes through time. May you find sanctuary and peace with your kin tonight under the stars. Let their tale rest in quiet peace.